Hello, everybody. Hello. It's time for the dessert. I know you're all very tired, but we're going to have a fantastic talk by Mike Otsuka and a pummeling from Pummer. You can put on the first picture. I'm going to say something about Jeff. This is one. No, you put on the wrong one. Mike.
Okay, sorry about that. I only see one picture here. Where's the other one?
Oh, you only had one thing to do correctly. Oh. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yes.
Cool, thanks.
One of my memorable occasions with Jeff, there have been many, but this is my most memorable one, showing Jeff's generosity. This was at the Moral Philosophy Seminar in 2016 at the dinner. And what you see there is my suit and my shirt. After Jeff he had not just like threw a glass of wine on it. I mean, as his papers, it was much more elaborate and complicated and sophisticated. Jeff was going to pour me a glass of wine. And by doing that, the glass fell, and Jeff was trying to save that. At the same time, he was holding a bottle of wine. So what happened? Rather nice. I mean, that's the kind of most generous kind of spraying of wine I ever had. And as we know, Jeff is very generous. Now, you can turn to the next picture.
I'll try.
As we heard, Jeff is very generous, so he went and bought me a new suit. It's not bad. I was, a couple of hundreds or something. It was expensive. Now, I was, of course, wanted to pay for it myself, but then, and especially when actually, surprisingly, my old suit came back from the dry cleaning, also paid by Jeff, and it was actually rather clean. So I wanted to pay this. And then Jeff said, no worry. This is covered by my research expense account. Actually, moral philosophy research expense account. So generous in a way. So I think I'm the only one who has a linen suit paid by the moral philosophy seminar research account. Now, on a more serious note, I think Jeff can be described as a person that one asks, why haven't I spent more time with him? Because it's always so enjoyable and intellectually stimulating. But I'm the chair, so I'm not going to talk much more. We're going to have Mike, and Mike is going to give a paper that I like, since it's about Jeff's best paper ever, which he wrote as a graduate student when he was at the age of 29. It published as Problems of Population Theory, which is also the title of his PhD dissertation. It would have saved a lot of ink and paper had people read it very carefully, which Mike now has done. But I also find it interesting that then Jeff stopped. He was the leading population ethics person at the age of 29. And then he stopped, and he started writing about shooting people and stuff like that. So even when you make such a grave career mistake, you can do very well. Anyway, with no further ado, Mike, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So, in Appendix G of Reasons and Persons, the one called Whether Causing Someone to Exist Can Benefit This Person, Parfit writes, causing someone to exist is a special case because the alternate would not have been worse for the person. We may admit that for this reason, causing someone to exist cannot be better for this person, but it may be good for this person. An endnote to this last sentence reads, I owe this suggestion and much else in Part 4 to J. McMahan. Now, Part 4 is the part of the book called Future Generations, which consists of such greatest hits as the non-identity problem, one chapter, the repugnant conclusion, another chapter, the absurd conclusion, and the mere addition paradox. I mean, those things that we kept on begging him to bring back in his later career, instead of doing all this meta-ethics stuff. I mean, at least his very last publication was a return to population ethics. Now, back then, when Reasons and Persons was published, Jeff was a 29-year-old Cambridge PhD student. He had drawn this contrast between a life's being good for a person, though not better for her than her non-existence, in a long review essay published 3 years earlier in Ethics in 1981 entitled Problems of Population Theory, which is also the title of his PhD dissertation. Now, this was Jeff's first publication. It contains a wonderfully rich, insightful, and fertile discussion of the question of whether a person's conception can be a benefit. Now, this talk draws its inspiration from this early as well as Jeff's more recent writings on this topic. Jeff has maintained over the years that even if a person's life is worth living, and however well worth living it might be, her existence cannot be better for her than her never existing. In this talk, I shall defend the contrary view that when her life is worth living, a person's existence is not merely good for her, it's also better for her than her non-existence. I shall also defend the claim that an appeal to the fact that a person's life is better for her than her non-existence can provide a response to the complaint that it's not going as well as it could. Now, to motivate an appeal to the fact that someone's life is better for her than non-existence as a response to the complaint that it's not going as well as it could, I'm going to begin with a scenario that doesn't involve a comparison of existence with non-existence. This scenario involves the imposition of an outcome upon someone which is less good for her than an alternative. And the fact that this outcome, even though not best for her, was imposed in preference to another outcome that would have been much worse for her provides a justification for that suboptimal outcome. Concrete illustration. So there's a strong case, let's suppose, for a new airport, and public officials are deliberating as to whether to build it near villages to the southwest or the southeast of a large city. And considerations are really finely balanced in either direction. Now, those who live in villages very near either the southwest or the southeast site will be severely affected if an airport is chosen near where they live, but only moderately affected if the other site is chosen. Now, those who live due south will be moderately affected whichever side of them the airport is chosen to be built. Now, these southerners have an equally strong complaint against an airport either to their southwest or to their southeast. But if the southwestern site is chosen, which the green arrow indicates, the southeasterners will be harmed to the same extent as the southerners and end up just as badly off as them. But it seems clear, however, that the southeasterners have a less strong complaint against the southwest airport than the southerners do. And this is because a reasonable and equally compelling alternative would have been much worse for the southeasterners, as it would have involved an airport in their backyard. That they will suffer only moderate rather than severe harm is a lucky break and a reason for relief relative to this alternative. And just as it counts against one's being at a certain absolute level of well-being, that one is worse off than one could have been, it counts in favor of one's being at that level, that one is better off than one could have been. Now, turn to the case of existence versus non-existence. I believe that a similar justification for the imposition of a suboptimal outcome upon someone can be offered when the worst alternative from which she has been spared is her non-existence, rather than her existence in a more burdened state. And consider the following case, which will figure quite a bit in this talk. In this case, you will adopt two children, dizygotic twins, who will be born a year from now. One of the pair will be a particular individual whom I shall call Anne. The other of the pair will be either Beth or Kathy. You must now choose among three options, D1, D2, and D3. If you choose D2 or D3, Anne will have a syndrome that will lead to her premature death at the age of 50, but have no further adverse effects. If you choose D1, Anne will live to the age of 70. However, the other twin, Beth, will suffer the same syndrome that leads to her premature death at the age of 50. Beth will be spared this syndrome and live to the age of 70 if you choose D2. But Beth will not exist if you choose D3. Rather, someone else named Kathy will be created in that case and live to the age of 70. And assume a linear relation between numbers of years lived and lifetime well-being. Let's consider the merits of a choice between D1 and D2 from among these three options. Here, things might appear to be perfectly symmetrical and evenly balanced with respect to the only two people who would actually exist in D1 or D2, Anne and Beth. However, Jeff and I share the conviction that matters are not in equipoise. Rather, you have decisive reason to choose D1 over D2, hence the green arrow pointing to D1, and our shared conviction is grounded in the fact that Anne's existence is independent of your choice, whereas Beth's existence depends on the choice you make among these three options. We both maintain that this difference renders Anne's complaint against D2 greater than Beth's complaint against D1. Now, later in this talk, I'll mention Jeff's reasons for maintaining that the contingency of Beth's existence on your choice renders her complaint less great. I'll also explain why I think Jeff has not provided a genuine alternative to my own account, but first I'll sketch my own account, plus Jeff's reasons for rejecting my account. This discussion of our contrasting views regarding Anne's grounds for her greater complaint than Beth's will highlight the disagreement between us, which I mentioned in my introductory remarks, regarding the answer to the question of whether non-existence is worse for a person whose life is worth living. Now, here's why I regard Anne's complaint against D2 as stronger than Beth's complaint against D1. Even though their complaints are analogous insofar as their complaints against being at 50 when one could have been at 70 instead, Anne's complaint against D2 is stronger than Beth's complaint against D1 for the following reason. If D2 is chosen, Anne will be condemned to her worst option. By contrast, if D1 is chosen, there will be another option that's worse for Beth, namely D3, in which Beth does not exist. I also maintain that the choice of D3 would not give rise to a complaint of Beth, that she's worse off than she could have been. Beth would have no such complaint for the simple reason that if D3 is chosen, then Beth would not exist, and hence there would be nobody around to be the bearer of such a complaint. Now, here I'm endorsing an asymmetry which many, including Jeff, have described as untenable. The asymmetry is exemplified by my affirmation and rejection of the following two claims. Affirmed claim, if D1 is chosen where Beth exists at 50, there will be another option that's worse for Beth, namely D3, in which Beth does not exist. Rejected claim, if D3 is chosen where Beth does not exist, this would give rise to a complaint of Beth that she is worse off than she would have been if I had chosen otherwise. Now, in defending this asymmetry, I appealed to the work of, conveniently, our chair, Gustaf Arrhenius and Wlodek Rabinowitz. They've argued that what follows from the claim that it's better for P to exist than not to exist is only that non-existence is worse for her than existence, since worse is the converse of better, but it doesn't follow that it would have been worse if she didn't exist. Now, in a recent piece called Climate Change, War, and the Non-Identity Problem, Jeff has mounted the following pithy critique of Gustaf's and Wlodek's view. He says, they accept that non-existence can be better or worse for P only if P actually exists. But if P actually exists, it's hard to make sense of the claim that non-existence is worse for her. She cannot now both exist and not exist. Jeff says her existence now might be better or worse for her than her non-existing was, or would have been, or will be. These comparisons are intelligible, though I think only the last can be true. Well, how shall we interpret Jeff's objection to Gustaf and Wlodek? Well, here's one possibility. Is it based on an inference from the following more general principle? Principle being, if some fact regarding P actually obtains at a given time, it doesn't make sense to claim that this fact not obtaining is worse for P at that time. This is because this fact cannot both obtain and not obtain at the same time. Well, I don't think this would be a sound principle. Here's a counterexample. Suppose that it's the afternoon and P is now actually in the shade, and we say sunlight is now worse for P than shade, since it's the afternoon. There's nothing wrong with the statement. It doesn't imply, in the context of the supposition that P is now in the shade, that the fact of P's now being in the shade both obtains and fails to obtain. In the context of the supposition that P is now actually in the shade, I think we would, and it would be warranted to interpret sunlight is now worse for P than shade as a counterfactual. Namely, if P were now in the sunlight, that would be worse for P. We would not interpret sunlight is now worse for P than shade as an indicative assertion of the contradictory fact that P is now in the sunlight. Now, in the light of these reflections on sunlight, I think Jeff's challenge to Gustaf and Wlodek can be reformulated as a dilemma. Recall that Gustaf and Wlodek are trying to draw a contrast between the following two claims by embracing the former while rejecting the latter. claim that Gustaf and Vlodek affirm non-existence is worse than existence for P who actually exists with a life worth living. Claim that Gustaf and Vlodek reject non-existence would have been worse for P if P didn't exist. So I think Jeff's challenge can be reframed as the following dilemma. The claim that P's non-existence is worse for P than existence can be read either as an indicative assertion or as a counterfactual. Well, on the one horn, if it reads as an indicative assertion, then it gives rise to a contradiction when conjoined with the supposition that P actually exists, namely the contradiction P actually exists and the fact of P's non-existence is worse for P. If on the other horn it's read as a counterfactual, then Gustaf and Vlodek have failed in the end to draw the contrast they were hoping to draw between the claim which they endorse that non-existence is worse for P who exists and the claim that they reject that non-existence would have been worse for P if she didn't exist. Now, on reflection upon the dilemma that Jeff's challenge poses, I now find myself driven to an affirmation of the following claim. If D1 is the actually chosen outcome in which Beth exists at 50, then D3 in which Beth does not exist would have actually been worse for Beth if it had been chosen instead. But I am now going to show how embrace of such a counterfactual, which Gustaf and Vlodek were trying to avoid, and which Jeff thinks gets us into difficulty, does not have the absurd consequence that merely possible people have a complaint against being harmed by not being brought into existence. And I agree that it's absurd to say that merely possible people have a complaint against not being brought into existence. I've said a merely possible person is nothing more than the eternal absence of a person whose actual existence was also possible. An absence of a person is not anyone, it's no one and nothing, and so lacks any moral standing to complain. To assume that an absence of a person is someone with moral standing is to take a metaphor possible person and transform it into a pale, ghostly person. Now, as I shall now explain, it's internally coherent, mutually consistent, and otherwise sound to affirm the following asymmetry, which consists of an affirmation of the first combined with a denial of the second of these two claims. This is the central asymmetry of my talk. Claim one, which I affirm, if one actually exists with a life worth living, then if contrary to fact, one had not existed, one would have been worse off. This claim is sound because here there's an actual person for whom it would have been worse if all the goods that render her life worth living had been absent. Here the counterfactual in which she does not exist can be assessed from the perspective of this actual person. The following second claim, however, does not follow from the first claim, claim two. If one does not actually exist, then one is worse off than one would have been if, contrary to fact, one had existed with a life worth living. Now, the second claim not only doesn't follow from the first claim, but the second claim is also unsound. It should be rejected. It's unsound because here there's no actual person for whom anything can be better or worse. There's also nobody in the actual world from whose perspective the counterfactual of her existence can be assessed. We can compare existence and non-existence from the perspective of an actual person in the first case, but not in the second case. Now, I think that in the light of these observations, we're now in a position to reconsider Gustaf's and Vlodek's central claim that even if it's better for P to exist than not to exist, it doesn't follow that it would have been worse for P if she didn't exist. What does follow is only that non-existence is worse for her than existence. Now, consider the case of Beth, for whom I've chosen D1, a life of 50 years. I would maintain, as Gustaf and Vlodek do, that in the event that that in this event D3 is worse for Beth, i.e. non-existence is worse for her, but unlike Gustaf and Vlodek, I now interpret this claim as a counterfactual conditional, which is nested in the consequent of an indicative conditional. Having chosen D1 and thereby made it actual, the following counterfactual is true. Had I chosen D3, that would have been worse for Beth. Now recall Gustaf's and Vlodek's reason for denying that it would have been worse for P, where here P refers to Beth, if she did not exist. They deny this for the following reason. One of the relata, P, would then have been absent. Now, I grant that Beth would be absent in D3, but when I say that Beth would have been worse off if I had chosen D3, the Beth to whom I refer when I speak of how Beth would have been is not the non-existent Beth in D3. I'm not saying that Beth is better off in D1 than Beth would have been in D3 if I had chosen D3. I grant that that would be problematic, since Beth would not have existed in D3 if I'd chosen that option. I'm expressing a different thought, namely that had I chosen D3, that would have been worse for Beth, where Beth refers to the actual flesh and blood Beth in D1. So let me just try to spell things out from a slightly different angle. Beth, what I'm saying is Beth, the actual person in D1, is better off having had the goods of life than Beth, the actual person in D1, would have been if Beth, still the actual person in D1, had counterfactually not had these goods, because Beth, still the actual person in D1, had counterfactually never been brought into existence because D3 had been chosen instead. Now, in so anchoring my evaluations in a reference to a person who actually exists, in making statements regarding a counterfactual in which he doesn't exist, I'm taking a position which can be lent support from no less an authority than the sadly recently deceased Robert Adams. In the latter of a pair of influential papers called Theories of Actuality from 1974 and Actuality and Thisness from 1981, Adams writes the following. He says, "My parents could have had, instead of me, a different son whose eyes would have been just a little bit bluer than mine are." But then he asks, how can that be possible? In explaining how this can be possible, Adams imagines the following exchange. What color are you thinking his eyes might have been? Just a little bluer than mine are. The actual color of my eyes is used to say how blue his might have been. Here we're describing a possible but non-actual situation from our perspective in the actual world, as we do when we say I might not have existed. If we were describing, quote, from inside a world in which I would not exist, we could not use my eyes as a color sample. Now, as Adams explains in an earlier passage from the same article, a world story, by which he means a maximal consistent description of things as they are or could be, a world story that includes no singular, which is to say directly referring propositions about me, constitutes and describes a possible world in which I would not exist. It represents my possible non-existence, not by including the proposition that I do not exist, but simply by omitting me. That I would not exist if all the propositions it includes and no other actual propositions were true is not a fact internal to the world that it describes, but is an observation that we make from our vantage point in the actual world about the relation of that world story to an individual of the actual world. And in an influential passage, Adams goes on to say the following. Let us mark this difference in point of view by saying that the proposition that I never exist is, in the actual world, true at many possible worlds, but in none. Only propositions that are included in a world story are true in the world it describes. They are the ones that would be true if that world were actual. And this distinction applies as follows to the case of Anne, Beth, and Kathy. Suppose that D1, in which Beth exists, is the actual world. The proposition that Beth never exists is in the actual world D1 true at world D3, but not in world D3. Now, Adams's view has been described as a perspectival version of actualism. And Jeff himself once elegantly articulated a view which might also be characterized as perspectival actualism. He did so in the aforementioned debut publication, Problems of Population Theory. Coincidentally, this was published in the exact same month and year of October 1981 as the piece by Adams from which I've just quoted. And here's what Jeff wrote, and it's such a nice passage that it's actually going to spill over 2 slides. He wrote, "From the perspective of an actual person, non-conception can be viewed as an alternative which would have been worse or better for that person. This contention should, moreover, be compatible with the obvious truth that in cases in which conception does not in fact occur, this is not worse for the person who might have existed. The difference between these two contentions is that while the latter implies that there is never any subject to whom any misfortune could be ascribed, the former presupposes that the subject is entrenched in the terra firma of actuality. It seems possible, continuing the quotation, it seems possible on the basis of the foregoing contention to reason as follows. If we produce a new person, he can then claim that his non-conception would have been worse for him, and therefore that on the comparative view, his conception was better for him. Thus, even on the comparative view, we would have benefited this person by bringing about his existence. Now, in recent correspondence with me, Jeff has offered the following reflections on this view. He says, in that early piece, I simply commented that this suggestion, the long quotation, is, quote, obscure and inconclusive. I now think that this view is implicitly self-contradictory. If it would have been worse for me never to have come into existence, then if the actual outcome had been that I did not come into existence, that would have been worse for me. But in that case, there would have been no me for whom never existing was worse. Therefore, I, who now exist, cannot coherently claim that non-existence would have been worse for me. And Jeff has written that this incoherence besets my own claim regarding Beth, in the case of Anne, Beth, and Kathy. He writes, it seems that what you, me, say about this case is this, that D3 is worse for Beth than D1 when D3 does not occur, but would not be worse for her if it were to occur. And he says, I can't see how to make sense of that. Nor could I understand, and on this we agree, the claim that D3 is worse for Beth when it's the actual outcome. So the heart of my disagreement with Jeff comes down to a denial of the following conditional that Jeff now affirms, namely that if it would have been worse for me never to have come into existence, then if the actual outcome had been that I did not come into existence, that would have been worse for me. In other words, it comes down to my aforementioned denial of the inference of claim 2 from claim 1. Now, in his 2022 contribution to the Handbook of Population Ethics, Jeff maintains that an analogous inference is entailed by the fact that better for and worse for are essentially comparative. And this is the English major background that Shelley referred to yesterday. The claim that to cause a person to exist would be better for that person thus entails that it would be worse for that person never to exist. But nothing can be worse or bad for someone who never exists. People who never exist cannot be victims of misfortune or the beneficiaries of good fortune. However, the argument I've been making does not involve a denial that better for and worse for are essentially comparative. Rather, I have shown, without having to deny this, that the inference Jeff makes from claim 1 to claim 2 is blocked by the loss of an actually existing person with a perspective on how things would have been otherwise when a possible world in which he does not exist is the actual world. Now, what I want to do now is explain how an actually existing person can coherently engage in a global assessment of her life as a whole, all of its days, and justifiably conclude that not to have lived at all would have been worse for her. How we can show from the perspective of the actual world in which someone exists, that non-existence is worse for that person. So you can compare your life lived up until now with a life lived up only until, say, the point at which you woke up yesterday morning. You might conclude that in spite of whatever unpleasant experiences, I mean, how could there have been any? This conference has been going on for the last 2 days, but whatever unpleasant experiences and other bads you have had during the past day and a half, the pleasant experiences and other goods were massively sufficient to make you glad to have lived during that period. To license the conclusion that not having lived for the last day and a half would have been worse on account of the absence of these goods of life for you, you don't need to compare what it was like to live for that period with what non-existence for that period would have been like. And you can also extend this exercise of a comparison of your life lived up until now to your life lived only up until a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, a decade ago, and so on. Ultimately, I think you can make a comparison of your life lived up until now with a life lived for none of these days and conclude that it would have been worse, again, on account of the absence of the goods of life for you if you had not lived any of these days. So many people with disabilities, they regret, say they're nevertheless glad that they weren't aborted. They regard it as better to have lived with this loss than not to have lived at all. And this is a sentiment that can be shared by anyone who regards their life as having been worth living on balance. And suppose that you're among those who are glad that you weren't aborted. You might try to justify such gratitude on grounds that you were once a fetus, you and that fetus are one and the same human individual, therefore you would have been harmed if that fetus had been aborted. Now, it would, however, appear to involve an absurd existential leap beyond gladness that you weren't aborted while in your mother's womb, a leap out of the womb from being into nothingness to the further thought that you're glad that your parents met, since you would have been worse off if they hadn't met. How, many will insist, could you have been worse off, given that you could not conceivably have existed, pun intended, if your parents hadn't met? Now, Jeff acknowledges that the fact that people do manifest attitudes of gladness concerning their own conception suggests that this conception is at least intelligible. And we can, I think, make the following sense of the claim that you would have been worse off if your parents hadn't met. We can refer to you, a subject entrenched in the terra firma of actuality, in Jeff's wonderful phrase. We can refer to you and the fact that you, this living, breathing human being, would not have had all the goods of your life had you never been conceived. Now, I'd like to show now how I think I can draw support for the view I've been defending from what strikes me as a theoretically well-motivated extension of Jeff's own well-known time-relative interest account of the badness of death. Now, on Jeff's account, death at the age of 30 is worse than death in infancy, even though the infant is deprived of many more years of the goods of life. And this is because the sort of perspective the 30-year-old has on the whole of his life and its future is different from whatever perspective the infant has. The 30-year-old, but not the infant, has hopes, aspirations, and plans for his future and would be deprived at time of death of future stages of himself with whom he would be psychologically connected and continuous. Now, Jeff's claim that death as an infant is less bad than death as a 30-year-old is anchored in the perspectives or lack thereof of the individuals at the actual times of their death. Well, I think we can ask a somewhat different question. We can also ask how bad such deaths in infancy or at the age of 30 would have been for someone such as Jeff, who was actually in his 70th year of existence. I'm glad that Helen has already, murdered Jeff, et cetera, given him a heart attack, so I don't have to be the first. So I would maintain that both death as an infant and non-existence would have been worse than death at the age of 30 for Jeff, where the referent of Jeff is now the emeritus professor entrenched in that bit of terra firma over there where he's now seated. And it isn't the inchoate perspective on his life of the infant Jeff that grounds the worseness of death in infancy than death at the age of 30 for Jeff, the person now in this room. Rather, death in infancy is worse from the perspective of the emeritus rather than from the perspective of the infant. This perspective of the emeritus encompasses Jeff's retrospective assessment of the goods of his life over a 70-year span, including his enlightenment as a boy to the evils of hunting and eating animals, the broadening of his horizons as a Rhodes Scholar in Oxford and as a student of Parfit, Glover, and Williams, his subsequent contributions and accomplishments as a philosopher over the decades, including his ascension to the White's chair to extend a distinguished lineage tracing back through Broome, Griffin, Williams, Hare, J.L. Austin, Pritchard, Ross, and T.H. Green, and his value as a teacher, mentor, colleague, father, and husband. From the perspective of the emeritus, both death as an infant or lack of conception, i.e. never to have existed at all, would have been worse than death as a 30-year-old. They would have been worse since the emeritus would have lacked many more of the goods of his life to which he's now psychologically connected. Well, one might persist in objecting that my claim that non-existence is worse from the perspective of an actually existing person is insufficient to overcome the incoherence of the implication that you would have been worse off if you hadn't existed. How could you have been worse off in a state in which you didn't exist? Now, to respond to this challenge, I'm going to draw an analogy to temporal cases of substantial change involving your non-existence in which you can coherently and truly claim that you would be worse off in that state in which you don't exist. Now, first, let's consider the familiar fission case in which you divide into lefty and righty. The fact that lefty and righty are non-identical, the symmetry of their relation to you, and the transitivity of identity render it impossible for you to be identical to anyone after your division. Nevertheless, it would be a change for the worse for you to divide into and become lefty and righty if their lives will be filled with nothing but torture. You'd be justified in anticipating and dreading becoming each of lefty and righty, even though you will not be the same person as either of them. We can also appeal to fantastic cases in which you in which you change, I can't pronounce that word, into a gigantic insect or into a satisfied pig. Even if it's impossible for you to retain your identity through these changes on account of the loss of your essential nature as a human being, these would be changes for the worse for you. As John Stuart Mill maintained, few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for the promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasure. It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be McMahon dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. The fact that you're not around after your substantial change into a pig doesn't defeat the claim that this would be a change for the worse for you. Its relative badness can be assessed from your perspective prior to this transformation. Death is another example of a substantial change for the worse for a person. Here there's nothing on the other side of the existential divide to experience anything. Hence, death comes closer than the other examples of substantial change to the case of never having existed, which has been the topic of this talk. Now, nevertheless, and people will probably point out, these cases of substantial change all involve temporal transformations, and they're therefore very different from counterfactuals in which I don't exist, where the divide between existence and non-existence is modal rather than temporal. And actually, I don't think it's possible to construct purely modal, non-temporal scenarios involving becoming. It's not coherent, for example, to say that it would have been worse for me had I never been a human being, but rather had become a pig. Rather, we need to say something like, it would have been worse for me to have been created a pig rather than a human being. This, however, appears to involve an affirmation of a trans-world identity rather than being a claim about becoming. And as a claim about trans-world identity, it's moreover highly problematic, the sort of thing that can be made sense of only on something like the supposition that I'm essentially a soul whose incarnation can range across the animal kingdom. Now, while acknowledging that the temporality of these claims involving becoming mark a significant point of disanalogy from the modal claim that I would have been worse off if I had never existed, I'd like to press the following point of analogy. To account for the badness of death, Jeff allows for an anchoring in reference to the interests of the previously but temporally no longer existing person. I hope I might appeal to this analogy to overcome resistance to my modal anchoring of an assessment of the badness of your non-existence to the vantage point of your actual existence. Just as we can anchor in reference to the previously but no longer existing person in the temporal case, we can anchor in reference to the actually but not counterfactually existing person in the modal case. Now, in drawing this talk to its conclusion, I shall turn to a discussion of Jeff's claim with which I opened this talk, that existence can be good for a person. Now, Jeff has coined the term existential benefit to refer to such a benefit a person receives when she's brought into existence with a life worth living. He maintains that this benefit is non-comparative in the following respect. It's not better for the person than her non-existence, it's merely good for her. And as discussed earlier, Jeff denies the coherence of the comparative betterness claim. Now, although existence is not better for a person than non-existence, on Jeff's view, he nevertheless maintains that someone with a life worth living has reason to be grateful for having been brought into existence. And so applying this to our earlier case of Anne, Beth, and Kathy, Jeff maintains that Beth's reason to be grateful that she exists in D1 rather than not existing in D3 explains why her complaint against D1 is less great than Anne's complaint against D2. Contrary to my view, however, Jeff maintains that this is not because D1 is better for Beth than D3, rather it's because D1 would merely be good for her, whereas D3 would not be good for her. Now, I don't see, however, how gratitude for having been brought into existence can be justified unless existence is better for the person than her non-existence. And what I'll do now, since Theron presents my argument and then criticizes it, I'll let Theron present this bit of my argument in his response, because otherwise I'll just be presenting it twice. And just in the interest of time, what I want to do now is finally draw this talk to its close by briefly explaining why I think that the view I've been defending also accounts for a different asymmetry that many affirm, namely the so-called procreation asymmetry, that we have reason not to bring someone into existence who will lead a life that's worth not living because full of unredeemed suffering, for example, though we lack reason to bring someone into the world whose life will be worth living. Now, on my account, just as a merely possible non-existent person lacks standing to have a complaint against not being brought into existence with a life worth living, a merely possible person lacks standing to have a complaint against being brought into existence with a life not worth living. Rather, it's the person who is actually brought into existence with a life of suffering who would have a complaint that her life is worse for her than non-existence. No actual person, however, has a complaint against not being brought into existence with a life worth living. Thank you.
And now for Professor Pummer.
Well, thanks so much to Mike for the wonderful paper. It's really great philosophy and a lovely tribute to Jeff in so many different ways. Let's just start with the case that kicked off the debate between Mike and Jeff. It's this Anne, Beth, and Kathy case. I'll talk more about the case in a bit, but for now it's enough to note that the debate started in response to Mike's claim that if D1 is chosen, there'll be another option that's worse for Beth, namely D3, in which Beth does not exist. So Jeff rejects this claim. Jeff argues that Mike's claim implies that if D3 is chosen so that Beth doesn't exist, this would be worse for Beth than either alternative that would result in her existence. And both Mike and Jeff regard this implication as absurd. So they regard it as deeply implausible that things could be better or worse for merely possible people. So Mike wants to block this implication. Initially, Mike attempted to block this implication by appealing to a view defended by Gustaf Arrhenius and Vladek Rabinowitz, which I'll call the ARV view for short, or just the ARV for short. According to ARV, well, non-existence is worse than existence for P who actually exists with a life worth living. It's not the case that non-existence would have been worse for P if P didn't exist. Jeff objects to ARV. According to Mike, Jeff's objection can be interpreted as a dilemma. If P's non-existence is worse for P than existence is read as an indicative assertion, then it gives rise to a contradiction when conjoined with the supposition that P actually exists. So we'd then be saying P actually exists and the fact of P's non-existence is worse for P. But if P's non-existence is worse for P than existence is instead read as a counterfactual, then the worry is that ARV fails to distinguish between the claim that endorses that non-existence is worse for P who exists and the claim that it's meant to reject, that non-existence would have been worse for P if P didn't exist. So I'm going to leave it to Gustaf to comment on whether this, yeah, okay. I didn't think you'd have a problem responding there. But so Mike thinks that this argument against ARV does succeed, and so he appeals to a different view instead. Drawing inspiration from Robert Adams, Mike develops a form of perspectivalist actualism that I'll call Mike's actualism. According to Mike's actualism, counterfactual claims of the form A would have been worse for P than B hold if and only if P exists in the actual world. So crucially, this includes counterfactual claims of the form non-existence would have been worse for P if P had not existed. So remember claims 1 and 2. Claim 1, if 1 actually exists with a life worth living, then if, contrary to fact, 1 had not existed, 1 would have been worse off. And claim 2, if 1 does not actually exist, then 1 is worse off than 1 would have been if, contrary to fact, 1 had existed with a life worth living. So Mike's actualism is consistent with claim 1, but not claim 2. So Mike accepts claim 1, and he rejects claim 2. And you saw the slide showing the recent correspondence between Mike and Jeff. Jeff suggests that claim 1 implies claim 2, but I think Mike's right. Mike is right that if Mike's actualism is correct, this inference can be blocked. After all, in claim 1, but not in claim 2, the individual in question exists in the actual world. So the question is Mike's actualism correct? So I do find Mike's actualism plausible, but I'd like to mention an objection to it. So consider the following case. We can either create no one, that's option D1, or create Anne at 50, that's D2, or create Ann at 70, that's D3. And suppose that in actuality, we create no one so that Ann does not actually exist. Mike's actualism implies we must reject claim 3. According to claim 3, even though Ann doesn't actually exist, Ann would have been worse off if, contrary to fact, we'd created her with 50 than if we'd created her with 70. But we might find claim 3 quite plausible. Now, it's true that on Mike's actualism, we can say that if we'd actually created Ann at 70, then it would have been worse for her if, contrary to fact, we'd created her at 50. But it's not clear that this captures all we want to be able to say about Ann. Arguably, we also want to be able to say that it would have been better for Ann to create her at 70 rather than 50, even though Ann does not exist in the actual world. Now, perhaps Mike can just bite the bullet here, or maybe it's not much of a bullet on closer inspection, but it'd be interesting to see whether Jeff wants to accept claim 3. So if Jeff accepts claim 3, and takes the Ann case to be a counterexample to Mike's actualism, then I think he may need to offer a different explanation of why it's absurd to claim that if one does not actually exist, then one is worse off than one would have been if, contrary to fact, one had existed with a life worth living. In particular, Jeff may need to abandon his suggestion that the absurdity of this claim lies in the fact that the one does not actually exist. Right? After all, that's true of Ann as well. Ann isn't entrenched in the terra firma of actuality, but nonetheless we might want to be able to say that it would have been better for Ann to create her at 70 rather than 50. Moreover, the fact that Jeff rejects both claim 1 and claim 2 suggests he might not think that the fundamental problem here is essentially about not existing in the actual world, right? As after all, the individual in question does actually exist in claim 1. One way Jeff could maintain his rejection of both claim 1 and claim 2 is by adopting the two-place requirement, according to which if A is or would have been better for P than B, then P exists in both A and B. This requirement will, against Mike, rule out claims of the form blank is or would be better for P than blank whenever P doesn't appear in both blanks. And the two-place requirement is consistent with claim 3. That is, this requirement is consistent with the claim that it would have been better for Ann to create her at 70 rather than 50, even though Ann does not actually exist. Here, the two-place requirement is satisfied, even though Ann doesn't exist in the actual world. All that's needed is for Ann to exist in each of the two possible worlds being compared. So if Jeff rejects both claim 1 and claim 2 and accepts claim 3, then the two-place requirement may be all Jeff needs. However, things will be more complicated if Jeff wants to, in line with Mike's actualism, reject claim 3, and, contrary to Mike's actualism, reject claim 1. Then Jeff may need to accept the two-place requirement to capture the rejection of claim 1 and accept a version of Mike's actualism that specifies a necessary condition. So we can call the latter the actualist requirement that says counterfactual claims of the form A would have been worse for P than B hold only if P exists in the actual world. So remember, Mike's actualism says if and only if, thereby making P's actual existence necessary and sufficient, whereas the actualist requirement specifies a necessary condition only. So Mike's actualism implies claim 1, effectively bypassing the two-place requirement. The actualist requirement is consistent with the two-place requirement and doesn't imply claim 1. What's more is that Jeff's remarks indicate that while we should reject both claim 1 and claim 2, we should find claim 2 especially implausible. Well, interestingly, the combination of the two-place requirement and the actualist requirement might be able to justify this attitude. While both claim 1 and claim 2 are incompatible with the two-place requirement, claim 2 is, in addition, incompatible with the actualist requirement. But on the other hand, right, I've suggested that claim 3 might be plausible, as we might want to be able to say that it would have been better for Ann to create her at 70 rather than 50, even though Ann doesn't actually exist. And if Jeff accepts that claim, if he accepts claim 3, then he cannot accept either Mike's actualism or the actualist requirement. And in that case, it would be a bit of a mystery why Jeff thinks claim 2 is more implausible than claim 1. So while I take the truth of claim 3, while the truth of claim 3 would be a problem primarily for Mike, the truth of claim 3 might also pose a bit of a puzzle for Jeff as well. Okay, so let's return to this case that got the whole debate started, the Ann, Beth, and Kathy case. Mike and Jeff agree that Ann's complaint against D2 is stronger than Beth's complaint against D1. Mike says this is because if D2 is chosen, Ann will be condemned to her worst option, but if D1 is chosen, there'll be another option that's worse for Beth, namely D3, in which Beth does not exist. By contrast, Jeff says Ann's complaint against D2 is stronger than Beth's complaint against D1 because Beth has a reason to be grateful that she exists in D1. For Jeff, it's not that Beth is better off in D1 than in D3, where she doesn't exist, but it's the fact that in D1, Beth is the recipient of the non-comparative good of a life worth living that grounds her reason to be grateful. And against Jeff, Mike argues that without the claim that D1 is better for Beth than D3, there's no reason for Beth to be grateful in D1. So Mike argues that for gratitude for your existence to be warranted, your actual existence must be better for you than non-existence. His argument involves a comparison of two cases. So first, the case on the left. Suppose that in this first case, the one on the left, that we choose D2, giving Beth a life that is barely worth living. But at no cost to anyone else, we could have instead chosen D3, giving Beth a life well worth living. Mike argues that while D2 is, on Jeff's view, non-comparatively good for Beth, Beth has a reason to resent rather than to be grateful to her creator for having chosen to bring her into existence with a life barely rather than well worth living. Resentment would be justified on grounds that D2 is worse for Beth than D3. So Mike thinks it's a fact about betterness that grounds resentment in the first case. And then he considers a second case, this is the one on the right, and it's just the same case as before, but without the option of D3. Here Mike says that by parity of reasoning, Beth must rate her non-existence as worse for her than her now one and only possible existence to justify gratitude rather than resentment for having been brought into existence. In other words, just as it's a fact about betterness that grounds resentment in the first case, so too must a fact about betterness ground gratitude in this second case. Mike says that the non-comparative goodness of Beth's existence with a life worth living is insufficient to justify gratitude when D1 and D2 are the only options, as, after all, in considering the first case, we saw that such non-comparative goodness was insufficient for gratitude in the presence of the better option, D3. So Mike concludes that for gratitude for your existence to be warranted, your actual existence must be better for you than non-existence. So if I've understood Mike's argument correctly, it seems Jeff might be able to defend the following counter-argument. Jeff could argue that in both cases, the non-comparative goodness Beth enjoys in D2 gives her some reason to be grateful. Since in both cases, it's a relatively small amount of non-comparative goodness, this reason to be grateful for D2 is in both cases relatively weak. In the second case, on the right, this weak reason to be grateful is unopposed by anything else, so that Beth has overall reason to be grateful for D2. However, in the first case, on the left, Beth has a strong reason to resent the selection of D2 over D3, as there's such a large gap in well-being between D2 and D3. This strong reason to resent the selection of D2, grounded in the fact that D3 is much better for Beth than D2, outweighs the weak reason to be grateful for the selection of D2, grounded in the non-comparative goodness of D2, so that Beth has overall reason to be resentful in the first case. So in sum, it seems to me that if Jeff can appeal to the relative strengths of reasons to be grateful or resentful, and to what someone has overall reason to be grateful or resentful for, then he can coherently capture the key intuitions about Mike's two cases in a way that's compatible with the view that Beth has a reason to be grateful in virtue of her existence being non-comparatively good for her. That is, even if her existence is not better for her than non-existence. If this is correct, then Jeff can maintain that in the original Ann, Beth, and Kathy case, Beth has a reason to be grateful for D1, which explains why her complaint against D1 is weaker than Ann's complaint against D2. Okay, so that's basically the end of my comments, and I just wanted to end on a note of gratitude, just having spoken about it. I'd like to sincerely thank both Jeff and Mike for their mentorship and friendship going back to my days as a grad student. It really means a lot to me, and it means a lot to me to be able to participate in this debate between them and to be at this conference. And as the last person, as the last commentator, I think we should all thank Elad again for putting together such an amazing conference.
So a short reply from Mike.
Yeah, very briefly, I'll just refer to your slides. First, thanks, Theron. This is fantastic and really challenging and clear and insightful set of comments. First of all, I agree that the particular argument I presented, that gratitude requires betterness, is mistaken for the reasons that you point to on this slide. I haven't completely thought through a response, but one potential response is, I still think that gratitude for the existential benefit, gratitude for existence requires that existence be better than non-existence. And what I might want to do is change the left-hand case, not so that you can either not create the person or create the person at D2 or D3, but just suppose that the person's going to exist no matter what, and you have a choice between D2 or D3. Now, both D2 and D3 have this non-comparative goodness of existence, but suppose you choose D2. That has a non-comparative goodness of existence, but that's not enough to justify gratitude, because you have to know whether D2 is better than, say, the only alternative available to you. In this case, it's much worse for you, which is also non-comparatively good, much worse for you than the other alternative, and that means that, and therefore resentment is justified. And then when the only two options are on the right hand, D1 and D2, I think to be able to establish that you're grateful that you're in D2 rather than D1, it's not enough to establish that it's non-comparatively good for you. It's also got to be better than the alternative. I mean, so I think I may be able to revise the argument to respond to your objection. Okay, now to go back to your first objection. So first, I think this is a fantastic challenge to my actualism. Before trying to respond to your challenge, what I want to say is, so you propose the two-place requirement as something which is able to capture the intuition that you have, that even if Anne doesn't exist because D1 is the actual world, it would have been better for Anne if D3 had been brought into existence than D2 would have been. You appeal to the two-place requirement as a means of defending that particular intuition. Now, I think a problem with the two-place requirement insofar as it is a defense on Jeff's behalf is I don't think Jeff accepts it. I don't think he can accept it because I think the two-place requirement makes it very difficult, maybe even impossible, to explain the badness of death. Because, death is a state in which you don't exist. And we want to say that that is worse for you than existence. Maybe there's a way of salvaging the two-place requirement in explaining the badness of death. But I think I recall that in that early piece that both Gustaf and I have praised so much, Jeff points to this problem with the two-place requirement, that it can't account for the badness of death. Okay, so that's not a way out for Jeff. But, I mean, what about me? How do I deal with your objection to what you call Mike's actualism? So what I want to say, I want to bite the bullet, right? And I want to say, if you don't exist, if Anne doesn't exist, then it's just an illusion to think that had Anne been brought into existence at D3, that would have been better for her than D2. When we think of those claims, we're, I think, implicitly thinking, well, had D3 been the actual world in which she's at 70, then D2 would have been worse for her, but that's consistent with my actualism. And when we think, oh, we can still make these claims without, assuming that either is the actual world, I think we're really just sort of, it's just the illusion that we think that anything can be better for Anne, who doesn't exist, than anything else. In the same way, there's an illusion to think that existence can be better. It can be better for Anne that she had existed if she doesn't exist. So I think that it's really, one really needs to implicitly draw on actualist assumptions in order to salvage the particular claim that we all want to make, that it would have been better for Anne to exist at 70 than at 50. Right. Thanks.
So, yeah, put up your hands, and I will start by giving it to Jake first. And then keep your hands up, and I will write down who you are.
Awesome, thank you.
Jeff. Jeff is...
I don't know that guy.
I wonder if you think that if you had never existed, you'd have been shorter than you are. Are you taller than you would have been? Even if you say that that's intelligible but false, like the explanation that you gave for why it's not just could be true, but is true that you'd have been worse off if you never existed. It was thinking about, well, we can imagine if you didn't live this day of your life and then all of these days, and that would have been worse. But if we lopped off this part of your head and then this part of your head all the way down below, you'd keep getting shorter and shorter and shorter, but we don't.
Okay, right, so yeah, I don't want to say, had I not existed, I would have been shorter or weighed much less than I am. So I want to say, had I not existed, there would have been no me to have any of these properties. But then I also want to say that there is this loss for me, the actually existing person, of, well, I guess my height and my weight, among other things, but also of all the goods of life. So I think I want to be able to say that from the perspective of the actual person, I can think of all these things I like. I guess I like the fact that I'm incarnated and have height and weight, and all the goods that I've experienced over the last 60 years. I want to say that not having those things would be a loss without, I think, having to then say that there would have been this non-existent entity with a lifespan 0, a weight 0, a height 0.
So, when you say there's a loss, do you want to say you would have lost out on all of these goods if you hadn't existed, but you don't want to say you would have lost out on any of your height if you hadn't existed? Or do you want to say there's a loss, but no one loses it?
Well, I would have lost out on being embodied with a height and a mass if I had never existed. And those are, I suppose, goods in addition to all the experiences that they make possible. Yeah.
Thanks.
Good. Jeff seemed to insist that he should say something, so let's go for it.
Thank you. I really liked and benefited from all of that. Thank you both so much. I had 6 points that I'm going to try and make very briefly. First point, I agree with Theron's McMahonian counterargument. Thank you for that. I thought that was right. Second, I accept your claim 3. I think these are claims about, somebody who would exist. These are claims about what would be the case of somebody who would exist in the two outcomes considered. For the exact reason that Mike gives about death, I have to reject the two-place requirement. Point 4, I am making these very brief. Point 4, I think the reason that Mike thinks his explanation is going to imply the asymmetry is really just that it's going to be an asymmetry between complaints and gratitude. And I'm inclined to think that there probably is some asymmetry of that sort. Just answering another question that you posed, Theron. I think that no, forget about that one. That's too trivial a point. Another thing, though, is this. One of the points that I do want to make to call to Mike's attention is Mike equivocated in the piece between the outcome in which, say, Beth or whoever it is doesn't exist is worse for Beth, and Beth's being worse off in that outcome in which she doesn't exist. As Derek pointed out in an appendix, I think, in Reasons and Persons, worse off implies a kind of two-state condition. So you have to exist in both states to be worse off in one than in the other, because that implies that you're off in some way in the other. So I think your points would be more plausible if they were always stated by reference to an outcome being worse for, rather than saying in the outcome in which this person would never exist, that person would be worse off. Final thing is that just if Mike were right, and this is the important point I think I'm making, we would, and it was better for somebody to come into existence with a life worth living and worse for somebody to come into existence with a life that's not worth living, we would lose the distinction between what Derek calls narrow person-affecting considerations and wide person-affecting considerations. And if we did that, we would, in effect, kind of lose the moral difference between saving someone's life and causing somebody to exist. In both cases, I would be doing what's better for somebody. How would we distinguish between these now? I think it's an advantage of the view that when being able to distinguish between the claim, to say, it's an advantage of being able to say that when I save somebody's life, I'm doing what's better for that person. When I cause somebody to exist, I'm doing what's good for that person, but not what's better for that person. And if we have a kind of two-tier view that says that narrow individual affecting reasons are in general stronger than wide individual affecting reasons, at least to confer benefits, then we have a good explanation of why our reason to save somebody's life is stronger than our reason to cause somebody to exist. But on your view, in both cases, what we're doing is doing what's better for somebody. And then we lose the ability to explain the difference by reference to the distinction between narrow and wide individual affecting reasons.
Thanks. So as far as your last point, I think I'll keep with Theron's slides. I think that I've offered an account of how it is that we can justify the stronger reason we have to choose D1 over D2. You say, well, you appeal to the presence or absence of non-comparative goodness to try to explain the difference. But what I want to say is that Beth has less of a complaint against being at 50 rather than 70 than Anne has it being at 50 rather than 70, say in D2 rather than D1, because of the fact that there is this alternative to being at 50, which is something that could have been chosen justifiably. That's worse for Beth, namely her non-existence. And so that's how I try to explain the asymmetry that we both affirm. But then the things I want to be able to offer that explanation without also being saddled with the claim that people in these non-people in these empty slots have a complaint against not having been brought into existence. Okay, and so what I try to do then is defend claim 1 while rejecting claim 2. By rejecting claim 2, I don't get that absurd consequence. So at least I've offered an account in probably has all sorts of problems, but at least the account does track the very difference that we both want to track. Now, I agree that a lot depends on an asymmetry between complaints and gratitude. And if I'd heard Shelley's presentation before writing this, then I would have paid much more attention to that fact. The complaints versus grats, I mean, I call them anti-complaints, much better to call them grats. And I think that when it comes to our obligations, complaints are what's fundamental. What no one has because what no one has reason to reject is what's fundamental. Okay, now that's a huge topic, but that's why I think complaints are more significant than gratitude. We have obligations to do things which no one can reasonably reject. I mean, you might try to find a way in which no one could reasonably reject states, there not being states of affairs in which they're not, no one can reasonably reject being denied having an outcome and for which they're grateful, but I think it's going to be difficult to explain the wrongness of not bringing people into existence, where all we can point to is the fact that they'd be grateful if they'd be brought into existence, whereas there is no complaint if they're not brought into existence. Okay, and right, so I think that's responsive to all the points I wanted to respond to that you made. Thanks.
Was there a quick one?
And I just had a really small thing, just to try and sell you a little bit more on the two-place requirement. You could state it that A is better for P than B, then P exists at some time or other in both A and B. So that's then compatible with explaining the badness of death. But I take it would do the work needed in the debate with Mike. It would still rule out claims 1 and 2.
Good, let's pass the microphone to Larry.
Thanks very much for that great talk and great commentary. I'm going to apologize to most people in the audience, though not all. I want to ask Mike a kind of inside baseball question, which will help me to understand your view better. I don't know if it'll help other people or not, but I hope it will. John Broome, as you know, in Weighing Lives and Weighing Goods, when he had to deal with these kinds of cases, refused to put a number in the alternatives where someone didn't exist. He just put a Greek letter, let's call it mu, I forget which one he actually used, but it's omega. Okay, so he puts omega there. And then that was important to him because if there's not a number, then you can't say better or worse, so he's got this omega. I wondered whether or not, in fact, you've given us a view where we should think about it this way. If, in fact, you picked out D1, then, or D2, I'm thinking now for Beth, then instead of omega, you'd actually put a 0. But if, in fact, you picked D3, then instead of 0, you would put an omega. So in other words, the value of Beth's life in D3 depends upon whether or not, in fact, you pick D1, D2, or D3. If you pick D3, it's omega. If you pick the others, it's 0. Then it's intelligible. And if that's the way you're thinking about it, then, of course, that's an essentially comparative view in the way I think about those, as in rethinking the good. And those kinds of views, as you know, generate non-transitivity, which I know you try to resist, though many of your views actually commit you to it anyway. So I'm just, so you might as well take it here too. So I'm just wondering if, in fact, I'm interpreting you right. So I'm trying to understand your position, the nature and structure of it.
Thanks. So did I understand you correctly to be proposing that my view can be represented as follows? If say, Beth exists, then the badness of D3 non-existence for her is 0.
Correct.
But the actual world is D3.
Yes.
Then we just leave a sort of a blank, right?
Correct.
Okay, yeah. So I agree with the latter. We just sort of leave things blank if D3 is the actual world. Now I'm tempted by the view that we gain meaning to the 0 point by asking the question, and this is actually something that Jeff proposed in that 1981 piece. I don't know whether you want to recant this as well. so the 0 point, you didn't quite propose this, but I think it's there's no obvious way of making sense of the 0 point in terms of, taking the goods of life and the bads of life, and then you subtract the bads and you get 0. I mean, how do you make sense of that? It's not as if, the goods and bads of life are these quantities out there, right? That we can then just put on the scales or something like that. But I think that the 0 point is really made sense of only when we ask questions like, well, is my life such that I prefer existence to non-existence? And if you say it's just at that threshold, then that's the 0 point. And so this is by way of saying, yes, I think I would say that there's D3 should be 0 if D1 is the actual world, and that there's a good justification for making it 0. And we're not committed to all sorts of strangenesses, that there is this non-existing person, merely possible person who's got well-being level 0. Right.
So we're late in the day, Larry, so I will move the mic behind you to Tim.
Thanks. I have a question about your first reply to Theron, your reply to the McMahonian counterargument with the two Beth cases. So if you could put that slide up.
My first reply to whom? Baron?
Theron.
Theron. Oh, sorry, yeah.
Theron Pummer.
Okay. So, sorry.
The Pummler.
So you want Theron slides? I thought you said Baron, like Baron Trump or something like that. So you want my
the slide with your reply to the McMahonian counterargument that you were suggesting. Yeah, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, that'll do.
Okay, yeah, right. Okay.
So I think so. Theron's suggestion was that Jeff could say in the 3-option case on the left there that if we choose D2, Beth can be a little bit grateful because she has this non-comparative benefit, but also strongly resent not being made better off, right? And your suggested reply, if I understood it, was that we can switch out that 3-option case on the left for a 2-option case, a revised case, where the only options are D2 and D3, and Beth exists in both. And you said in that case, Beth's non-comparative benefit in D2 would be the same as her non-comparative benefit in D2 in the case on the right, right? But it seems like Beth can be grateful if we choose D2 in that second case on the right, but she couldn't be grateful if we choose D2 in the revised left case where there's only 2 options, right? So it can't be the non-comparative benefit by itself that explains our judgments about Beth's gratitude or lack of gratitude. We need the claim that non-existence is worse for Beth than existence with a good life in order to explain it. But it seems like...
But yeah, the but was coming, yeah.
It seems like if we choose D2 in that case on the right there,
on the right.
Jeff could explain Beth's gratitude in that case by saying, first, she benefits in a non-comparative way, so she has this intrinsically good life. But if D1 had been chosen, it wouldn't have been the case that Beth had any non-comparative benefits. And maybe that can explain why Beth is grateful for our choosing D2. That explanation could apply to your original case on the left there, but it wouldn't hold in the revised case that you were suggesting, because it wouldn't be true in that case that if we chose D2, Beth could say, if you hadn't chosen D2, I wouldn't have had any non-comparative benefits. So I think the McMahonian counterargument holds up here.
Okay, I think my response would draw on my response to Larry, right? Which is, so we have these non-comparative existential benefits, and then we also have the flip side, I think, these non-comparative existential burdens, being brought into existence with a life full of suffering versus being brought into existence with a life worth living. Now, I think that in order to assign that as a non-comparative burden or, quote, non-comparative burden or benefit, there's implicitly a reference to whether this is better than, whether you regard your life as better than things would have been had you not existed, where that then becomes the 0 point. So I think we still, at least, I mean, maybe you can come up with some other way of explaining what it is that makes something an existential benefit versus an existential burden without saying the benefits are better than non-existence and the burdens are worse than non-existence. I suppose that would be a challenge for Jeff, but if you can't, then basically your reason for gratitude has got to be because of the comparative fact that existence is better than non-existence.
Okay, so next on the list is Gustaf. Good. You claim that there was some kind of contradiction, so if you can put on that slide.
Okay, right.
You called it contraction, but I think you meant contradiction.
Oh, did I say contraction? As I just wasn't able to. Gustaf, you mentioned. Oh, funny, because Gustaf said there's a typo, and I just couldn't see the typo because. Contraction, yeah, funny.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see any contradiction at all. It seems to me only is a contradiction if you assume that the only thing we can compare are state of affairs that are obtaining. And of course, I mean, Jeff's non-existence and Jeff's existence can't obtain at the same time. But that's not how we make comparison. We compare sometimes obtaining state of affairs with non-obtaining state of affairs, which are, they are abstract state of affairs. So, for example, assume that you have a nice 10-feet boat, and you are considering that you should have a 20-feet boat that doesn't exist. And you compare what would be the advantages. Maybe you can fit more of your opera the CDs in the 20-feet boat or something like that. So that we do all the time. And what Vladek and I had in mind was that we were comparing this, this obtaining that, that you have one person here, the person who exists is obtaining, with the abstract of state of affairs that he or she doesn't exist. And all of this abstract state of affairs, they can of course be part of different relations, such that it's worse for that person. So I don't see any kind of contradiction.
Okay, so I think I might be happy to accept that, but also then defend the claim that you deny that non-existence would have been worse for you. But let's see if we can, let's just unpack what this third alternative is. Okay?
What third alternative?
Well, there's the claim that, so we're trying to interpret existence is better for you. If you exist, then non-existence is worse for you.
I should add that concrete objects, they can only exist if they're obtaining.
Okay,
and a typical example of a concrete object is a human being or a person or a life.
Okay, right, so suppose you exist. How do we understand non-existence is worse for you? Okay. And I offered a dilemma. It's either understood as an indicative assertion. There's the indicative assertion, Beth exists, and then non-existence is worse for Beth is something like the indicative assertion, Beth's not existing is worse for her. But then, as Jeff said in his criticism view, that seems to be a contradiction. Okay, so that's the
Where's
one.
The contradiction?
Well, anyway, so I think you want. Okay, so maybe you want to say, are you happy with saying it's both true that Beth exists and it's not the case that Beth exists? No, you don't want to say that because you'd say that's a
no. There's an abstract state of affairs.
Okay.
That is Beth not existing.
Sorry.
I'm comparing that.
Let me just state the two things against which then you're presenting a third alternative. So anyway, so now we see what the one thing is that you reject because it's basically literally contradiction. Beth exists and not the case that Beth exists. Okay. The other thing is to say that, suppose Beth exists, non-existence is worse for her, is to say what I now accept. If Beth exists, then if contrary to fact Beth had not existed, that would have been worse for her. Okay. I assume you still want to reject that. Now, what exactly are you proposing as neither of these two things? I think you're saying, suppose that the actual world is one in which Beth exists, then non-existence is worse for her should be understood as the state of affairs in which there's no Beth is worse for Beth. Okay, and then what I want to say is, well, there is no Beth, as you know, there's no concrete object. Now, maybe you want to say that it's worse for the abstract, merely possible.
No, it's worse for Beth, who is an actual concrete living person.
All right, good, yeah.
Think about that. You can say that you prefer a world V1 where you exist over a possible world where you don't exist. There's nothing mysterious with that.
Okay, yeah, good. So we're on the same page in saying worse for Beth is worse for the Beth entrenched in the terra firma of actuality. I hope you still like that phrase, but
it's a nice phrase.
Yeah.
I accept that.
Okay, so we agree on that, and then there's this, and I think that maybe what I could say is, well, drawing on Robert Adams.
I think I have no contradiction with Robert Adams.
Sorry?
Yeah, I have nothing that.
Okay, cool. So maybe
basically, what I'm saying, you're all right as long as you don't listen to Jeff. Just forget listening to Jeff, and it will be all right. Okay, are we allowed to go to 6 o'clock, or should we stop now? Oh, I'm very sorry for the people who are not allowed to ask questions, but join me in thanking the lovely speaker and commentator.